Welcome back everybody to our weekly Moto News Show, where this week we'll be looking at KTM's significantly updated 390 Adventures, along with how they stack up to the competition and whether the 450 Adventure bike class is now the one to go for. Then there's a bunch of new bikes with updates to Honda's Mini Retros, new paint for Enfield's 350 Classic, and some super cool custom Indians to vote on, and then we'll wrap up with some sales data that Honda announced from 2024, which I think you'll find pretty mind-blowing. But first up, we've got to start with that new KTM 390 Adventure announcement, which I think offers something that a lot of adventure bike riders have been asking for a while now. You see, the previous 390 Adventure, which has existed for many years, well, it isn't really that adventure-y, with it being largely based upon the 390 Duke platform and also getting cast wheels with a 19-inch front, so it's not particularly tall, it's not particularly off-road biased, and primarily, really, it's a road bike. New for 2025 though, we've got two variations to replace it, with the 390 Adventure X as the sort of entry point, but then also the 390 Adventure R, which is a more premium version that offers a more aggressive off-road capable spec and riding position that I think, like I say, is going to appeal to a lot of adventure riders. Still, at the heart of both bikes, you've got the liquid-cooled LC4C single, and while it has had a bunch of small updates for the new model year, I'd still say you're going to get pretty much the same character out of this bike, and also the performance figures are largely the same, with about 44 horsepower peak and 39 newton meters of peak torque. Where the big updates though become more apparent are with the chassis, with a new two-piece steel trellis frame that is shared with some of the other 390 models, but it does get its own dedicated steering angle, triple clamps, subframe mounts, radiator mounts, foot peg mounts, and rigidity profile, all in order to give it some proper off-road performance and rideability. Then you've also got this new subframe which looks super sleek, and that allows for more rear wheel travel. And the swing arm is also specifically built with off-roading in mind, with a new diecast design that's also used on the recently announced 390 Enduro R and the 390 SMC R Supermoto. So broadly, the chassis is really designed for, some decent off-road capability, but they have differentiated these two X and R models a bit by mixing up the spec of the suspension, the wheels, and the brakes. So the X is built to be more of a balanced all-rounder, whereas the R is really more focused and built for riding trails. Now both get a fork and shock from their in-house WP brand from their Apex lineup, as is very often the case with a KTM, but the X is a little lower slung at 200mm of travel front and rear, and also the fork is non-adjustable and the shock is just preload adjustable. The R is a little more jacked up, it's got 230mm of travel at both ends, and also it gets a bit more customizability to the ride, with 30 clicks of compression and rebound damping on the fork, and then 20 clicks of rebound on the shock, along with the preload adjustability as well. Clearly that makes the R the better choice for more challenging and undulating terrain, although I should still point out that the X model is a good 30mm longer in the suspension travel than that previous generation 390 Adventure, so it should still be, quite a bit of an improvement. Still, you've got cast wheels on the X model, again with the 19 front and the 17 at the rear. And so like I say, it's built for a balance of on and off road, and that'll give you probably a good choice of on and off road adventure tires. And then brakes are from Brembo's more affordable sub-brand Bybray, with a 2-pot floating caliper up front on a 300mm fixed disc. Now the R model, on the other hand, gets spoked wheels with a 21-inch front, an 18 rear, so that gives you more choice in terms of more knobbly, grippy tires for loose surfaces. And it also gets a slightly bigger front disc at 320mm, perhaps to sort of compensate for the bigger front wheel. And this one's a floating disc with a fixed caliper, and also this bike gets adjustable levers. Both though get a 14-litre fuel tank, both weigh in at 165 kilograms without fuel, so presumably around 175 both topped up. And they also get a 5-inch full-color TFT display, through which you get a bunch of connectivity features and also a choice of riding modes, including street, rain, and off-road. Both get ABS with a switchable off-road mode that allows you to disable ABS at the rear wheel so you can slide it in. And while both get switchable traction control as well, it's just the R model that gets a 3D sensor that makes the traction control lean sensitive. So plenty of little differences here and there, but I think probably one of the biggest factors in making a decision between these two new bikes is going to be the ergonomics, with a vastly different seat height between both. The X, well, it comes in at 825mm, which I think is reasonably manageable for an adventure bike like this. But the R, well, it's really quite lofty at 870mm, and so I think that might put it out of reach for some shorter riders, although I will say it probably does suit that taller stance. You've got the more travel in the suspension, and also generally a taller seat can make it easier to transition frequently between sitting and standing. Now naturally you'd expect, I think, to pay a fair bit more for the R model, and that is the case, although I will say both still look like pretty good value for money, with the X starting at £5,399 and the R at £6,699. Thing is though, if you fancy that more affordable X version, you will have to wait quite a bit longer, with KTM saying that the R models will be available in dealers from March, whereas the X won't be available till autumn 2025. That seems like a slightly weird decision to make them available after this year's riding season, but perhaps that's a product of the sort of financial difficulties and restructuring that they're going through at the moment, perhaps scaling back production on bikes like these for the time being. Still, they've got loads of new bikes in the works for this year, and these announcements follow on from a couple of other 390s in previous weeks, including the 390 SMCR Supermoto, which we covered a couple of episodes back, and also in between that there's the new Enduro R, which is very much off-road focused. It does have me kind of wondering though, well, is there enough to differentiate the Enduro R model from this new Adventure R model to sort of justify having both of them in the current lineup? After all, the engine and the chassis are really very similar, right down to the wheels and suspension and tyres, but I will say, comparing the specs, the Enduro R does come in a little bit lighter, and that's probably owing to the fact that you don't really get any wind protection, so there's not as much bodywork and there's no windscreen either. Also, the fuel tank is quite a bit smaller at 9 litres to the 14 of this Adventure model. The TFT dash is a lot more stripped down and dirt bike looking, along with the headlight, and so I suppose the Enduro model does kind of make sense if you're intending to do the gross majority of your riding off tarmac. Plus, it's quite a bit cheaper at £5,699, so you could save yourself £1,000, and I guess there's no point in paying for a big windscreen and a bigger fuel tank and a bigger TFT dash if you don't really ever intend on using them much. Now, we'll round off this section about the new 390s by saying that, of course, these financial struggles that KTM are going through continue, with a final hearing for their proposed restructuring and search for capital to take place at the end of February. So while I would expect them to find some way to move forward, perhaps that is something to consider if you are looking at one of these new bikes. Otherwise though, I've got to say I do really like the look of these new KTM 390 Adventure models. They look like a big improvement over the previous generation. The visuals are quite cool too as well, with that high front mudguard and the kind of rally looking front end. And I guess they're going to fit the bill perfectly for this growing market of small to mid capacity bikes, where we've seen loads of new models introduced over the past year or two. Thing is though, you know, are they good enough to go toe-to-toe with some of the existing bikes on the market, or is there something better already out there? Well, look, let's take a look through some of the key competitors, as well as, you know, their relative strengths and weaknesses. I think a great starting point has to be the Royal Enfield Himalayan 450, which has only been on the market for about a year now, but already looks like it's proving to be really popular. This one follows on a course from the air-cooled Himalayan, which I think it's fair to say is a bit of a cult bike, with a super low price point and a simple spec that offered just enough performance for some no-frills adventure riding. I mean, I say just enough, but it really is by the skin of their teeth, because about 20 horsepower on a 200 kilo bike really does feel quite slow. And so for me, the move to this new liquid-cooled 450 Himalayan was massively needed to keep pace with the market, and it really is a big improvement in terms of usability out on the road. You can more comfortably now perform overtakes at like 60 or 70 miles per hour, and also when you're starting to accelerate out of corners, there's enough there now to make it actually feel, you know, borderline fun, which wasn't necessarily the case with the air-cooled bike. Elsewhere, you've got a really off-road capable chassis, you've got an easygoing riding position with a moderate seat height. The typical typical Enfield styling job with plenty of vibrant and varying finishes, and also this interesting new round TFT display which maintains a bit of a traditional form factor but actually houses some fairly modern capabilities. So look, this one might not be the most exhilarating bike ever made, and it's not perhaps the best finished when you look at some of the competition, but with a really decent starting price of £5,750, you really can't grumble too much. There is, though, another very good option, and this one comes from one of KTM's manufacturing partners, and that's the 450 MT from CF Moto, which again has been very popular since it was introduced last year. Now, being designed and built out in China means they can keep the costs similarly low, so this one actually comes in a little cheaper at $5,699. And I will say, I think it does offer a little bit more spec and more features than the Enfield, and also some better, more rugged adventure bike looks. You get adjustable suspension with 200mm of travel front and rear. There's spoked tubeless wheels as standard with a 21-inch front and an 18 at the rear. A good standing position with high and wide bars, a TFT dash, an adjustable windscreen. You've got folding foot controls, you've got a bolt-on subframe, so it's all really nicely thought out for adventure type riding. But I think for me, more than any of that, it's the engine configuration and the soul and feel that gives it that makes it probably a bit more desirable than the Himalayan. You see, it gets a parallel twin with a 270-degree crank, so it's got a bit of that big bike sound and feel. And so while it isn't really significantly different to the Enfield in terms of actual performance figures, it just feels, to me anyway, it's a little bit personal taste, but it just feels a lot more satisfying to ride. Perhaps one shortcoming is that it is quite choppy on and off the throttle at lower speeds, and that does become more of an issue if you're off-roading, I guess. But ultimately, you know, there's going to be some trade-offs for such a feature-laden bike at that price point, and so I think it can probably be forgiven. Now, I guess you could also count the Honda NX500 in this kind of part of the market, which follows on from the CB500X of years prior, although they have given it, with this new name, also a bit more of an adventure-y look, with stacked headlights at the front and a sort of slim rally-like front end. You do get a 19-inch front for a little bit of off-road ability, but I think overall you've got to say this is really a road-focused bike. With a seat height of 830mm, a relatively low stance and a vulnerable underbelly, and so this one is more so a competitor for the 390 Adventure X than it ever could be for something like the R model. Being a twin with a little bit more capacity as well, the power figures are about as good as it gets in this class, with 47 horsepower peak and 43 newton meters of peak torque, although you will have to pay a little bit more for it, with this one coming in at close to $7,000 actually, at $6,849, so a good chunk more than the 390 Adventure X. Now I think you could also maybe consider, in this part of the market, the Triumph Scrambler 400X, presuming you don't mind a sort of naked bike, and also if you fancy a bit of a retro look. I guess its biggest strength is probably the engine. The 400 single is a bit of a peach. It's got a really nice, deep and rich soundtrack at the exhaust. It's relatively smooth as well versus some of the competition, but again, I'd say with a lower stance than some of the other bikes in this part of the market, the 19-inch front wheel, and a less natural riding position if you want to stand up. You know, really, this one is built in the majority for road riding, with a little bit of off-road capability as a sort of bonus. So yeah, when you take a look at some of these existing options, I think the KTMs do look really well set. The Adventure R is probably the most aggressive and tall and off-roady spec that you can currently get. The suspension travel at 230mm is really lengthy. It's got the weight as well, which looks to be one of the lowest. And also that tall seat height, I think actually is a bit of a strength, because it gives you a proper, purposeful adventure riding position, whereas bikes like the CF Moto and the Royal Enfield are quite a bit lower to kind of balance off-road riding with on-road usability. Thing is though, I will say, if you're not 100% sold on this 390 Adventure right away, then it may well be worth holding off for a bit, because there are plenty of other options seemingly on the way from other manufacturers which also look quite off-road biased. One of the most anticipated will be the new F450 GS from BMW, which was first shown at EICMA in Milan last year in November, and it has all the looks of a baby R1300 GS, but hopefully a lot more slender and agile, and also it should come at a fraction of the price too. Still, at the same time as being hopefully quite affordable, it still looks like it gets the proper BMW design and build quality, with their typical switchgear layout and TFT dash, and a chassis that looks really quite well spec'd, with an adjustable fork and shock, spoke tubeless wheels and also braking courtesy of Brembo. Then you'll also get their new 450 parallel twin, which makes a good 47 horsepower peak, and also a unique firing interval of 125 degrees that they say has never been used on a motorcycle before, so that should give it a little bit of a point of differentiation. On top of that, BMW claim it all weighs in at close to the 175 kilograms of the KTM, and so it really does look like a very exciting prospect, this one. Although my only question is whether with all those goodies and decent spec, it'll be close enough on price to look competitive versus the CF Moto, the KTM, or whether they'll have to wander over that $7,000 mark. I guess being built out in India by their partners at TVS should probably help to keep the price down, and that's an arrangement they already take advantage of with the 310 models. But look, I guess we'll have to wait till later in the year to find out for sure when the full specs and details are announced, which is, anticipated to be probably around EICMA this year in November again. On top of that though, another 450 has been spied out testing in the form of Aprilia's Touareg 457, which is basically the love child of two already very good bikes. You see, the Touareg 660 is widely regarded as a great option in the middleweight adventure class, with a proper off-roady spec, classy Aprilia styling, and also I'd say plenty of tech and features for the money. The RS457 on the other hand is their budget-friendly A2 sports bike, and when I rode it a couple of months back, I really did enjoy the cracking little parallel twin that again gets a 270-degree crank for that big bike sound and soul. To me, the marriage of the two is a bit of a no-brainer, with a lighter, more affordable Touareg fitting this new class of bikes perfectly, and also the engine not really feeling like a massive step down from the 660, especially if you're riding off-road where the peak power is much less important. On top of those though, Kawasaki have also recently thrown their hat in this ring with a slightly unusual display at EICMA, and also I saw this a couple of weeks later at Motorcycle Live in the UK. Now it's just the front end of a new bike sticking out of a box, but you can tell from the looks of the wheel and the suspension, and to be fair, the branding on the box, if you care to walk around it, that this will be a brand new KLE model. And so it looks like another twin, and this one could be a very decent option indeed. Now, one assumes it will get the same 500 twin as their Z500 Naked and the Ninja 500 sports bike, which is similar in character, I guess, to the Honda engine in the NX 500, with both having a 180-degree crank. So perhaps if for some reason you're a fan of that particular engine configuration, then this one is worth a look, especially if you were considering the NX 500 but wanted something a bit more off-road capable. But look, how do you reckon those KTMs stack up? And is the 390 Adventure R now the one to go for, or would you pick one of the others from this list? Let me know what you think down in the comments. Like I say though, that's a lot of new bikes recently in this particular class, and it definitely seems to be, the biggest development in the adventure market recently. Now, perhaps that's because the cost of living's going up, so cheaper bikes are becoming more desirable, or perhaps riders are just fed up of trying to lug around on big adventure bikes, especially when it comes to off-roading. I wanted to find out a little bit more about this one, so I ran a poll earlier this week to find out which class of adventure bike you guys would be most likely to buy in 2025. Would it be that small to mid class that we've just looked at some of the options from, or maybe the 700 to 1000cc class, which gives you a bit more power and perhaps versatility, so thinking about bikes like the Tenere or the Tiger 900 or the 890 Adventure? Or is the large capacity Lita Plus Adventure Tourer still the king? Well, the results actually kind of reflected what we're seeing with all these new bike announcements, with 41% of you, at the time I wrote this script anyway, voting that you'd prefer the smaller bikes, and another 41% preferring the sort of mid to large capacity bikes. Just 17% though said they'd go for the big full large capacity adventure bikes, although that is perhaps somewhat skewed by the pricing. I mean, $5,000 to $7,000 for a small capacity adventure bike is going to be far more attainable to a lot of people than the 17, 18, 19, 20 grand prices that we're really frequently seeing now in the large capacity market. I guess though, it's not just the price, because I looked through the comments and a lot of them are saying that big adventure bikes are just too big. Like 636 of the Beast says, I'm not interested in buying an adventure bike, but if I did, fuel economy, simplicity and ease of handling would be at the top of the priority list. RPDXC said, to me, the heavyweight adventure bikes are just too heavy. Matt in Grey said, smallest adventure class as possible. I'm not big and tall, so to handle a tall bike I need to just slide over to one side and tiptoe on one leg, and lightweight bikes are already a challenge, so don't even think about anything heavier than that. And then Kintsugi says rather have a 450 to 600 that's light and easy to live with, because I've had big heavy bikes before, and while it is fun having all the power, sometimes it's just too much of a chore to lug around. So yeah, it seems like, wow, for once, what you guys and more broadly the market is asking for is actually in harmony with what manufacturers are producing, with people wanting smaller, lighter, more affordable, more simple adventure bikes, and that's exactly what it seems like they're getting. Personally, I would say recently I did the Triumph Adventure experience on the Tiger 1200 Rally Pro, and it was really challenging winter conditions, lots of slippy mud and deep puddles, and I've got to say, while the bike really did impress me a lot, it's so capable and proficient at tackling that sort of stuff, you know, I did still find it largely quite stressful, and it's not even my bike to fix or repair afterwards. Now, I'm not that great at off-road riding, and I'm also not particularly tall either, so that doesn't help. And so while I didn't have any spills or, you know, any injuries or anything like that, you know, I was still kind of wishing I was on one of the Tiger 900s that the guide riders were using, or even something preferably smaller than that. So yeah, personally, I can't wait to get stuck into reviewing some of these smaller adventure bikes, and I really enjoyed the 450 MT last year, so hopefully some of these are even better than that. Would you agree though? Do you think the 450s are now the ones to go for, and are the manufacturers actually getting this one right? Let me know what you think down in the comments. Now, last week, Indian unveiled their 2025 lineup, with one of the new models being the Sport Chief RT. This bike is similar to the existing Sport Chief, but it does come with some weekend away type accessories as standard, like the high mounted side cases, the extra squishy saddle, and also some forward foot controls. Now, to celebrate or promote the introduction of this new RT version, well, Indian went away and commissioned 6 customs by their dealers, which are all displayed at Moto Bike Expo in Verona, Italy last week. So I thought, given that you can actually go and vote on their website for which one you think is best, and they'll announce a winner at a later date, you know, we can run through all of them, all 6, and see what we make of them. So first up, we've got American Graffiti by Indian Motorcycle Praha. And although, of course, a lot of the features like the side cases and the fairing have got to remain because they're essentially promoting this new RT spec, well, it really does look like they've gone to town on the rest of the bike to really make it pop. I'm loving that paint job, including the fade on the frame. And then also you got some nice accents of red on the shock and on the valve covers, as well as a bit of a cheeky belly pan. They've done a front mudguard delete, and also that mirrored windscreen really does top it off nicely. Next up, we've got Bastard from Motostrada Porto. And while this one is a lot more subtle, there is some nice detail still in the paintwork, and also I'm liking those spoke wheels and the gold anodized fork. I feel like this one you could actually ride like as a daily and not stick out like a sore thumb. Next up, we've got Hoka Hey by Styrian Motorcycle. And pretty much all of these look to have some sort of custom exhaust system, which I bet sounds pretty sweet with that big Thunderstroke 116 V twin. You got silver on the wheels of this one, silver and green on the paint, and some green anodization. And this one looks pretty cool to me all in, and nicely themed and sort of quite cohesive. For something a little more bling though, we've got a build called No Comply Society from Crazy Horse here in the UK. A brilliant dealer, I've got to say. They've got really interesting brands, and they've let me review a few bikes at theirs in the past, so if you want to vote for them, please go ahead. But yeah, they've gone for a bit of gold on the wheels and on the risers, and it looks like a bit of gold leaf maybe mottled in with that green paintwork, although I'd have to see it up close to be sure, but I like this one a lot. The Quetcher comes from Biker Syndicate, and it looks like they've jacked up the front end maybe with some longer risers, a longer fork. They've lifted the fairing a bit as well, so this one actually looks structurally a bit different, whereas the rest have more so focused on the paint. And then the final bike is called Top Fuel, and this one comes from Indian Motorcycle Mets. I'm loving that they've tied in the brake calipers with the purple paint job. I like the pops of gold as well. Again, it's got what looks like a big loud pipe on it, and also an Öhlins shock at the rear with, I guess, the reservoir interfering with the side cases, so they've actually moved it up top. I wonder if that was an intentional choice, or maybe one of those unexpected hiccups that you kind of work out as you go when you're doing stuff like this. Either way, all cool looking bikes, and so I'll leave a link to the website down in the description below so you can go and vote. Also getting some snazzy new paint jobs for 2025 though, we've got some non-custom production bikes, and this time from Honda with their very cool retro mini bike lineup that includes the Dax, the Monkey, Monkey, and the Super Cub. All of these bikes have had their 125 single-cylinder engines cleaned up to meet the latest Euro 5 Plus emission standards, but at the same time they've introduced some new colours to keep them looking nice and fresh. Now, we'll start with the DAX with its iconic T-shaped frame, which gets a new pearl shining black paint job that goes along with the retained pearl cadet grey and pearl glittering blue. Then we've got the Monkey, which I think is fair to say is another iconic motorcycle, and this one gets 3 new colours for the new model year. So it now comes in sheen silver metallic with pearl shining black, millennium red and pearl Himalayas white, and turmeric or turmeric yellow and night silver metallic. Last up though, we've got the Super Cub. Is it fair to call this one iconic as well? They've certainly sold a lot of them, so I think it is. And this one only gets a single paint job for 2025, but it is pearl Bosphorus blue over pearl sugarcane beige, complemented by a contrasting red leather seat. That one does look really rather good. I absolutely love ripping around on the DAX when I had one for review. I think it was a couple of years back. It was definitely a real conversation starter as well when you were parked up. And so while there isn't necessarily anything a great deal new here, certainly from a technical perspective, well, you know, they didn't really need to change much because they already looked absolutely fantastic. On top of that though, we've also got a bit of a tweak on the Classic 350 from Royal Enfield. And for me, I think the appeal of these classics, both the 350 and 650, is in the fact that they're probably some of the most traditional looking retros that you can currently buy. Personally, I think I'd probably go for the 650 twin version, which they only just announced, just for a bit more usable power. But I will say the 350s still make a solid choice if you are on a bit of a budget, and also if you're just riding around town and at lower speeds, then it is just about enough power. Now for 2025, this one now gets 4 new colorways, 3 of them being pretty old school looking and also coming with the spoked wheels. So first up, there's a heritage finish called Madras Red, a heritage premium finish called Medallion Bronze, and a chrome version, which I think might be the nicest of the bunch, that gets a bit of emerald green on the fork shrouds and the headlight nacelle and the tank. This 4th paint job though that they've just announced I think is a bit of a curveball, because they've actually gone for a fairly stealthy finish, which is almost entirely matte black, and it gives it kind of the look of a much more modern, like, baby cruiser. It's the sort of finish you'd expect to see on like an Indian Scout or one of the Harleys or something like that. But I will say I do rather like it. I think the cast wheels help as well. And for $4,500, it really is quite a cool looking bike. All of them get some technical updates as well though. You've now got LED lighting in the headlight, the position lights and the indicators. They've fitted a gear position indicator to the dash as well. And also there's a new USB-C port up by the bars, which is of course super convenient if you do want to mount your phone up there and keep it juiced up. So yeah, some nice little updates here. I guess this one will continue to be pretty popular, although perhaps not quite as popular as one of its siblings, and that's the more modern looking Hunter 350. They're built upon the same air-cooled 350 single-cylinder platform, but for some reason the Hunter is a phenomenal seller, and I hadn't quite appreciated to what extent until a recent statement emerged from Enfield's chief commercial officer, which said that this particular model has sold a phenomenal 500,000 units since they introduced it just 2 years ago. To me, that's mind-blowing. I knew that the 350s and the 650s, to be fair, are both really popular here in the UK. They've got that retro charm and the accessible price point. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'd ever expected them to sell 500,000 of them globally. You know, for context, a fairly substantial motorcycle manufacturer like BMW sell about 200,000 bikes a year globally in total across all their models, although admittedly, you know, most of them at a higher price point than the Hunter 350, but still that is 250,000 a year for the Hunter, so Enfield have sold more on just one model alone. Clearly, Enfield have really got something right about this bike, and I did enjoy it when I rode it back on the launch, but I will say the only potential problem for it could be the new, or relatively new, Triumph 400s, which seem to have sold really very well, at least here in the UK in 2024. Sales data for the first half of the year showed that both bikes, the Speed 400 and the Scrambler 400X were right up towards the top of the chart, and mixing it with the GSs and stuff like that always sell every year really very well. And if you check out the equivalent list from 2023, well, these spots were more so taken up by the Hunter and the Classic 350. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that plays out when the full year of data is released. And also I'd be interested to know if anyone knows, how well are those Triumphs selling in India, where they're produced by Bajaj and where also Enfield sell the majority probably of those 500,000 Hunter 350s. Leave me a link in the comment if you've got any articles or data on that, but for me personally, out of the two, I'd probably still go for the Triumph just because it's got pretty much double the power of those air-cooled Enfields, even if you are having to pay about $1,000 more for it. Let me know your pick there as well down in the comments. Still, all of those numbers, as impressive as they are, pale in comparison to Honda, who also recently had a press briefing in which they summed up the motorcycle side of their business. Now, they announced for the current financial year that ends March 31st, 2025, that they're expecting to end up with a total global sales figure of 20.2 million motorcycles. 20 million bikes is just so hard to get your head around to kind of picture that number of bikes. And while of course a lot of it comes from smaller, cheaper, low capacity bikes and scooters in Asian markets, they say that's 85% of their sales, so 17 million. Even in the US, Europe and Japan combined, they've sold 1.2 million, which is still a humongous amount when you set it against other manufacturers. Apparently though, Honda aren't satisfied with 20 million bikes sold because they estimate that the total global market for motorcycles is around 50 million, and it'll grow if you include electric two-wheeled EVs to 60 million by 2030. Honda say in their goals to pursue carbon neutrality by producing more electric bikes that they're intending to grow their market share to 50% by then, and so that would mean they'd be selling 30 million bikes a year. How are they going to do that? Well, they outline quite a few measures, including using their dealership network of 6,000 locations in India to offer more charging points to try and reduce range anxiety from Honda electric bike customers, reducing the cost of ownership by building a dedicated electric motorcycle factory in India by 2028, looking at ways to recycle and reuse the batteries, and also, just building more electric bikes, introducing more models. They say 30, I think, by 2030 as well. Still, in Europe, those impressive sales figures are largely driven by what they call large-size fun models, and they put their success down to some existing lineups like the CB Naked, CBR sports bikes, Africa Twin adventure bikes and Rebel cruisers, but also the recent successful resurrection, let's say, of some historically popular sub-brands like the Hornet and the Transalp. They also claim a couple of techie USPs like the DCT automatic gearbox and the new e-clutch system have given them a bit of an advantage perhaps in some of these markets, and so they now claim the largest market share in 5 key European markets, specifically calling out Italy, Germany, France, Spain, and also here in the UK. I think though, the most interesting thing to come out of all this press briefing is a bit of an update on their V3 concept, which they announced at the back end of 2024, which is an interesting looking prospect, a very unusual engine configuration, and it also looks like it'll be turbocharged as well. They do mention it again as a sort of successful concept bike in the main press release, but I was reading up on this on Ride Apart, very good website, so do check it out if you haven't already. And they say that there was a longer Q&A with the press after the initial presentation, in which some of the senior managers from Honda's motorcycle division said they've actually ridden a working prototype of a V3 bike at the Honda factory in Japan just a couple of weeks back. They then went on to say that there are more updates coming soon, and so while they did say initially when they announced this concept that the intention was to take it to production, it's still good to see that it's on the cars and that the wheels are in motion, so to speak. I'm certainly looking forward to that one and wonder what kind of bikes they'll use it in, but let me know what you think of it down in the comments below. Now, I'll also put last week's episode on the screen now in case you missed it, in which we looked at some of the new cruisers and tourers on the market for 2025, and so do give that one a click if you haven't already. Hit subscribe as well if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news like this right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.